Good evening and welcome to APTA Live this evening for the third and final installment of a series we're conducting on healthcare leadership. This three-part series was designed to explore and encourage physical therapists in two areas: to consider leadership in their organizations as part of their career path, the APTA, and to collaborate with other associations such as the American College of Healthcare Executives, the leading professional association for healthcare leaders, and the National Rural Health Association, the advocate for good, solid rural health policy and advocacy in the United States. So tonight we're going to be joined by two executive leaders from the American College of Healthcare Executives and the National Rural Health Association, joined by their chief executive officers. A few years ago, to give you a little bit of history of this, a couple years ago, APTA began to investigate different leadership opportunities for physical therapists and whether we should invest in a leadership program as part of our ongoing continuing education and programming. We found many of our components that do this very well on the clinical side or on the practice setting side. And then we found other associations that really are experts in engaging their clinician community in leadership or rural health advocacy, as you'll hear tonight. So we're thrilled to have these two experts join us and really help us continue to explore healthcare leadership, what's going on in healthcare, and ways you as physical therapists can continue to become involved not only in APTA, but other associations that share your interests, passions, and advocacy. So we're excited about tonight's program, and we'll get started here shortly. But first, I'll just start with quick introductions. Joining us tonight are the chief executive officers of the American College of Healthcare Executives and the National Rural Health Association. Deborah Bowen is the CEO of the National College of Healthcare Executives. This association is really the home and professional community for healthcare executives of all hospitals and healthcare organizations of all different sizes. They have multiple programs that really help shape healthcare through leadership and developing the next generation and the current leaders that are going to serve health systems. Deborah's going to join us from Chicago tonight, and where the American College of Healthcare Executives is headquartered, and we're looking forward to hearing her expertise as we move into the program. Also joining us tonight is Alan Morgan. Alan is the CEO of the National Rural Health Association. The National Rural Health Association is the primary advocacy organization supporting healthcare in rural America and frontier areas, and really expanding how we make sure that we have high quality, accessible care in all communities in the United States. So thank you, Deborah and Alan, for joining us. And we're going to jump right in. And I'd like you, as the first question, and I'll start with Deborah, is really to introduce a little more details of who you are and the organization that you lead.
Well, Justin, first of all, it's a pleasure to be with you and Alan tonight. We're very proud of our relationships with our association partners, and clearly both of you are on that list. And we're very proud, Justin, of the work we're doing in leadership development with your organization and the promise that it can bring to future and present leaders. So, I mean, really, I think you did a good job yourself. You're hired. In case you're looking for another job, I just want you to know. But, you know, for about 88 years, ACHE has really been advancing leaders committed to make a difference for health. And I think that's really what it's about. I mean, healthcare is a business, but it is a business with a calling. And a lot of our members are really about the heart and soul of leadership. You need the hard skills, but you also need the soft skills. So as you suggested, I think already 48,000 members across disciplines, settings, large, small, lots of different types of ambulatory, post-acute, all different types of settings. And I'm proud to say that about 208 of them are actually physical therapists credentialed in your profession. And we also know in our membership profiles that there's a number of others who have therapy or rehab, some kind of other experience that may also be in the physical therapy world. So obviously, people are already involved, but we're looking forward to really explaining what ACHE is, at the end of the day, we don't lobby, and I know both of you do, and I have great respect for the lobbying world and what you do. That's not an easy job. We're really about education and networking and really leadership cultivation. At the end of the day, we do membership. We have a board certification. We believe if our clinical leaders are credentialed, so should our healthcare leaders. So we provide a credential that we've been updating and working on for many, many years. It's really been in existence for about 60 years. And certainly, we also do a lot of publications for graduate and undergraduate educators. So we're also in sort of the leadership cultivation job. So again, a lot to do and a lot going on. Career services are another part of who we are. But again, I'm looking forward to the opportunity tonight. I did just take on a new role as the president of International Hospital Federation. So I've got also a volunteer job now. So hopefully we can cultivate others to get involved in their associations. And like I said, I'm looking forward to the conversation tonight.
Well, thank you, Deborah. It's always essential that I think as in our roles as executives that we also volunteer and also serve. It makes us better leaders. It makes us understand the roles of when we're in our chief executive hat and then when we're in our board hats. And I that's commendable for you to take on that volunteer service. Next is joining us is Alan Morgan. Alan and I did cross paths as lobbyists originally. And so we both come from a history of lobbying. So we could have a whole second conversation about the career paths of lobbyists to healthcare executives and maybe invite our friend Sean Martin over at the Family Physicians to join us for that conversation. But I'm pleased to have Alan join us tonight. And Alan, if you would just give us a quick description of yourself, your sort of brief bio, and then a little bit about the National Rural Healthcare Association.
Absolutely. And thank you, Justin. And Deborah, so nice to be able to join this session with you. And congratulations on the new job you have as well, too. I saw somewhere that if you join one organization and become take a leader role in it, you're likely to take up to 7 or 8 other associations opportunities as well, too. So for those of us that get involved, we find that our plate is always full. Well, let me start with this. If you live in rural America, you work in rural America, or you care about rural America, there's a home for you within the National Rural Health Association. I think a lot of people that aren't from rural assume that rural is just a small version of urban, but it's really a unique healthcare delivery environment. It's a place where those most in need of healthcare services oftentimes have the fewest options available. But what our association does is we identify best practices. We share those best practices through our conferences and educational offerings for replication. And what I really like about rural America, in addition to the sense of community and the ability to collaborate among healthcare professionals, is rural is where innovation begins. You look at all the major significant innovations in healthcare over the last 30 years, and they all have the roots in rural America. So at the National Rural Health Association, we represent, our members include individuals, healthcare practitioners, policy leaders. We represent more than 90% of the nation's rural hospitals, rural health centers, and rural community health centers as well, too. And so we have a very broad membership base. And like Deborah, we do education, but we also do advocacy and policy development as well, too. We do a lot of research. We have a lot of, we publish the Journal of Rural Health, which is the world's preeminent journal, scholarly journal on rural health policy. But what we really do is we take your voice and hopefully make it louder at the federal level, at the national level, and we focus in on the issues that are impacting rural. And it's been my pleasure to be with the organization for 21 years now. As Justin mentioned, I first came on board as a lobbyist and have shifted to the CEO role. And honestly, and I'm sure Deborah and Justin will say the same thing, what keeps us going is our members, active members and leaders from across the country. They make this job worthwhile. So happy to join the discussion. And Justin, thank you for the opportunity again.
Yeah, well, pleasure to have you both. I think when I think of my peers in these positions and associations, you're sort of the 1-2 punch. I look to ACHE as sort of a leadership model. And I think, Alan, your history in lobbying is always an example of National Rural Health Association has always been one of the best lobby organizations in DC, and how you approach issues and really lead in the advocacy community. Tonight, we're going to explore leadership. As you've heard from both Deborah and Alan, healthcare is a team sport, but in team sports, you always need leaders and people stepping forward to take on challenges. And that's going to really be the focus of our conversation. We're going to explore a few issues on just healthcare in general, because we have two great leaders with us, but also a little bit about some of the leadership insights. So my first question as we begin tonight is, starting at that macro level, is what's the top issue facing your organizations in 2022 as we get ready to turn the calendar here in a few weeks? And how will your leadership seek to address this challenge? And so I'll go ahead and kick it back to Alan to really hit that of what their top challenge is and how leadership is going to shape how they address that challenge.
Well, thanks, Justin. That's actually a fairly easy question at this time and space because everything flows from it, and it's COVID. I think a lot of people don't realize that to date, infections per population in small towns are 80% higher than they are in urban areas. And it's just amazing just to hear that fact, 80% higher. And then for those that actually contract COVID in a small town, in a rural community, you're more than twice as likely to die from COVID. And it's just hard to believe the system that we've set up in these small towns to deal with that. That has a downflow effect on the entire healthcare system. So obviously next year, how do we address vaccination status within rural communities, within rural healthcare providers? How do we deal with the workforce situation that's arisen because of that? Many of these small town hospitals are paying twice the wages than they were pre-COVID, which is great for the workers. But the problem is the payment methodology is all tied in. This is going to dramatically impact the wage index in the fourth quarter and going into 2023. And then because of those issues, you have behavioral health issues among the community, among healthcare providers, and then the ever challenging nature of just keeping the doors open on clinics and hospitals. And again, this all comes from the fact that we're dealing with a global pandemic in a healthcare environment that was never designed for it.
Yeah, that's fabulous. I think, and I'll turn it over to Deborah to sort of address this next. But I think as we've looked at this at APTA, the issue post-COVID that has challenged us is labor issues. And just the mobility of labor, the cost of labor, the administrative burdens facing our labor force. We're just at APTA launched an initiative for the first time, really focusing on clinician wellness. Mm-hmm. How do we address clinician wellness and resiliency and things of that nature so that they can be fit to practice and serve the organizations in healthcare, whether it's members, large health systems or rural hospitals. So Deborah, same question, top issue facing the American College of Healthcare Executives in 2022 and how your leadership is seeking to address that.
Well, we actually ask our CEOs what keeps them up at night. And clearly it was obviously the pandemic. I mean, that goes without saying. But historically, it's always been around financial challenges. The interesting thing, though, now is everybody's talking about the top three challenges: workforce, workforce, workforce. So I would echo what both of you are saying in terms of that. And it's not only about burnout, which is a tremendously concerning problem. The rates of suicide and the rates of really people just trying to come in every day and battle COVID and these surges that keep waving through our country. I think that's concerning, but it's also the pipeline of all kinds. It's not only nurses, it's respiratory therapists, it's pharmacy assistants, it's all kinds of professionals across the continuum of care. And of course, you both noted the cost of labor. I mean, it's certainly the perfect storm when you add all of the demands of taking care of people today, which is where burnout comes in. and obviously keeping the doors open because of the cost of not only labor, but supply chain and all the growing concerns. So, obviously I would echo a lot of those issues. And, it's going to require, I think, both short-term and long-term solutions. And I think we're starting to pay more attention to that, but I think a lot more focus is going to need to be applied in order for us to really have the resources we need. I do think one of the intersections with the audiences is really about understanding how we take care of people in new and creative ways and how we leverage the full power of the multidisciplinary team. I think that's one of the hopeful things about thinking about workforce, and how do we redesign care so that we can deliver the care that we need. But again, I would echo that workforce is certainly the primary area of concern right now. Knowing that COVID is really the upstream dilemma, but workforce is really the present day problem going on in the agendas of healthcare leaders.
Yeah, I think, dealing with a public health crisis and an emergency puts an enormous stress on our healthcare systems and require leadership at all levels. But I think the combination of also dealing with workforce issues even makes that more complex. So we're just, as Alan said so well, the system wasn't really built for these type of emergencies, but now we're seeing not only is it not built, how do you staff it? And I know we each of us interact with our members who lead organizations, practices, hospitals, care facilities. I often hear from them, and I think Brett Altman made this comment on our first series, is these chief executives have had to turn into recruitment and retention cheerleaders.
Oh,
and can you guys talk a little bit or add any insights, whether it's in recruiting people to your organization or what you hear from your executives on the role of executives in really, recruiting, retaining, and supporting a healthy workforce?
Well, I do think you have to be a champion. Obviously, I mean, nobody wants to work for an organization they don't respect and admire. But I think what I hear is people really are investing differently and thinking about how they need to invest. They're offering more services, whether it be 24/7 childcare, paying attention to the demands of workforce and what's getting in the way of people and trying to reduce those barriers, but also making the job easier. We all talk about the administrative burden on our clinicians. How do we make the jobs easier? How do we build capacity? How do we support? How do we engage? And really, I think also on the minds of CEOs is, they're developing all kinds of partnerships, not only with community colleges, but academic organizations to build more pipeline, get more candidates, get more people trained for the longer term. I don't think anybody's got a panacea. I've heard of one organization that lost 700 nurses in one day and had to recruit 700 nurses in one day. That's a magnitude of a problem that obviously is going to require a multi-layered approach. But I'm sure Alan's going to have the answer, so I'm going to turn it over to him.
I only have questions, but Deborah, I think you hit it on the head. I think on the pipeline, and Justin, just what you said about the role of executives and leaders within healthcare facilities in recruiting. It really starts at home, and I think finally, as a nation, we're starting to realize that we've been doing this completely backwards for the last 30 years. We take the best and the brightest from upper income urban families, and then we train them in urban locations. And then we're dumbfounded they don't all work in Flush, Kansas. Who knew that wasn't a great, successful strategy to recruit people? So we're starting to see more federal funding and state funding going into rural residency training tracks and programs, and like Deborah said, partnerships with local academic institutions to identify rural kids that have an interest in staying with friends and family, and getting that homegrown approach. That really is the only way to it. Health Affairs has cited the significant decline in rural kids going into medicine, and we're just not doing a job we need to be to tell our kids, hey, there's a great job for you here at home. And we need to do that much better. Until that time, we still have to convince urban kids that Netawaka, Kansas is a great place to live and work, and we'll continue to do that.
Those are both fabulous points. I think one of the things and why we're highlighting both your organizations is we know that clinicians thrive when they have a network, when they have a support group, and when they find their people. And those people sometimes are clinically in the physical therapy profession, and there's sections of APTA that they find that community in, or it's finding other people who are dealing with the challenge that they're dealing. So if they are a physical therapist practicing in a rural hospital, how do they connect with other physical therapists practicing in a rural hospital so that they can learn, share, and develop those connections so they do retain and get job satisfaction and really become a stronger clinician, stronger leader, and things of that nature. So we really always appreciate that when our members connect with each other through your organizations and lead that way. So one of the things that's unique about both of your organizations is you're sort of clinician multidiscipline, and there's clinicians of all different types in your organizations, from physician leaders to physical therapist leaders to respiratory therapists, occupational therapists. You really are sort of the essence of the healthcare system in an organization. And so as you look at the key characteristics, what do healthcare professionals bring to the leadership table? What skills, what attributes as clinicians, when they make that transition into leadership, what do you see as leaders as some of those strong attributes? And I'll start with Deborah just to jump in on things she sees from rehab clinicians or other clinicians in leadership.
First of all, I don't think anybody gets into this business if you don't care about helping people. I mean, I do think there's a common bond around just the values that people share and that people have. I mean, almost everybody I talk to is really trying to figure out how to make a difference. I think the value of the multidisciplinary professionals is really about the different perspectives we all bring. I mean, physical therapists, for example, probably have a lot more insight into the day-to-day issues facing people in terms of not only their mobility, but what kind of support or what kind of systems, are they leveraging at home to improve their quality of life. So I do think the experiences of everyone, whether it's at, sort of at the, whatever their version of the bedside is, but also working with other multidisciplinary teams as physical therapists do, it really translates to a whole host of skills, whether it be multitasking or critical problem solving, using data to drive decisions. I think that's another attribute that's very, very important. Teamwork, communication. And so it's really, I think, a marriage between the hard skills that you need, but also the soft skills to really be, the humans that we are, to care for the patients and the people that we're serving. And we know that a lot of those skill sets are very portable to the management ranks. Those are all the same things that leaders are really looking for, that ability to problem solve, to be creative, to be agile, to really be at the table and be present and really build trust across disciplines, in the multidisciplinary environment. So I think all of those things contribute to the effectiveness and are important.
Alan, anything you want to add on some of the multidisciplinary skill sets that translate to leadership in rural health?
Yeah, absolutely. And in my role, I work outside the sector of health all the time with Farm Bureau, Farmers Union, National Rural Cooperative Association, many others. And I think I always find that healthcare leaders bring to the table empathy, compassion, and collaboration. And that's something I think that is a strong suit of healthcare providers and just why they join the workforce. And I also think now is a good time to acknowledge that as we continue to talk about leadership, with me talking about leadership with Deborah in the room, it's not unlike Al Roker talking about severe weather patterns with Noah in the room as well too. She really is the go-to person. We're talking about healthcare leadership. I think what I can add to this discussion though, Justin, is we work with 43 state rural health associations, and they all have different leadership styles. And leadership is the one factor that keeps rural hospitals open and clinics open. And we feel so strongly about that we in our organization have created 2 separate leadership track, a rural fellows program and a rural hospital CEO certification program for those healthcare professionals that want to get into the executive management role. I think I can't understate the importance that leadership plays in a rural community and in a rural healthcare in specific.
I would say too, not to cut you off, Justin, because you're running the show, but the thing that has struck me about the pandemic, and I think this is where relationships really pay off, is trust. And I think in rural communities, it's very evident. I actually have a place in a rural community up in Wisconsin, and the trust and relationships, words matter. All of that I think really is worth its weight in gold, particularly when you're going through a crisis or when you're going through some other dilemma. And there's a lot of opportunity in that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think 2 of my classmates in physical therapy school are now CEOs of rural hospitals. Mm-hmm. And they tell the story that really it was an opportunity because the physicians come in from the large city to do clinic once a day, but the physical therapists were there all week. And so they got really good at operations. They got really good at community networking. Physical therapy is a hands-on, in-person mostly. We've discovered that telehealth has worked well, but it really still is a investment on the patient side and a relationship between the patient and the therapist. And they really became leaders in those health systems because they were present, had a posture of learning, and then really started to learn operations and other skill sets. Generally, they were sponsored by a CEO of that rural hospital who helped them learn the ropes, and it's been exciting to see them take on those leadership roles and want to stay in those communities. And then they also, and you guys both have outstanding programs, then how do they augment their education? So just briefly, I'd love you both to describe, Alan, you just hit your rural fellowship and your CEO training program. I think our viewers are really interested as they are in these communities. How do they connect with your organizations to learn about those programs, whether that's the fellowship through ACHE or your programs at Alan at the National Health? So I'll start with Deborah. Talk a little bit about your fellowship program and how clinicians, physical therapists that are interested in that, begin to explore and invest in that area.
Yeah, well, obviously we have a lot of different types of programs depending on, we like to believe that we meet people where they're at in their career. You can be a member and you can activate on a lot of the programs that we have, and even some of the scholarships for those who may not be able to afford, investing in their professional development. Some organizations, oftentimes professional development is the first to get slashed from the budget. So we do have those things available. The thing that I always sort of remind people to do is to really think about, where they want to head. Obviously, being a fellow of ACHE does require certain things. It does require a master's degree, but a lot of people have master's degrees now. It does require education. It requires that you pass an exam. So it does require certain things, but then it's almost like its own network beyond that. But again, you don't have to be a fellow of ACHE to also activate on a lot of the other programs. We have programs designed for early careers, mid-careerists, senior careerists. I think, You've got, Justin, somebody in our executive program. We've got a senior executive program. We've got the Dolan Scholarship Program, because diversity, obviously our boardrooms and our management ranks don't look like the communities we're serving. So there's a lot of different resources available. But again, I think it really starts with somebody being interested in learning. We also have 77 chapters throughout North America. So, one of the whole premises of having a chapter locally is sometimes people can't afford to come to national programs, or in this remote environment, maybe that's not the kind of experience they're looking for. So we have local chapters and we have national. And I actually think starting in a local chapter is a good way to go if you're really just beginning and trying to find your network. And of course, those can be found easily at ache.org, by just looking in your area. But again, I always tell people to ask if it's not easy. Sometimes I think, we don't intend to make the simple complex, but sometimes I think we do. So if people have an appetite, they should definitely just contact us or work through you, Justin, however you want to activate around that.
Yeah, that's fabulous. Alan, talk a little bit about physical therapists that are interested or practicing currently in rural systems and want to connect into leadership programming in the Rural Health Association. What's the pathway to do that and some of the opportunities that are at hand?
Oh, sure. Well, let's start with the easy aspect of this. Rural health. That's really all you have to remember after my conversation this evening. Type the words rural health into Google, Yahoo, Bing, any search engine. We're usually the first site that pops up, or the first three. And on our website, you can simply click on programs. We have two different tracks, one inside the walls of a facility and one external, more community oriented. Our fellows program is more community oriented. And I have to be honest with you, I don't know if you, both of you feel this way, but sometimes just knowing how to drive the truck, which is our organizations, knowing how our organizations work, the mechanics of it, then allows our membership to have a national impact on policies impacting them at the local level. And really, a lot of our fellows program explains how do you use our association to advocate for your friends and family? What's the policy development process? How do we actually develop legislation? How do we identify best practices and then share them through our educational offerings? And through our fellows program, really get you a rounded perspective of how to work, not just in NRHA, but I think in APTA and any organization of how to use a nonprofit membership organization to help you do your job better. And again, for our certification program, that gets more into the operational side of it. And I think, Justin, you hit it right. You have to have both of those, certainly in a rural area, that the soft skills to be able to actually be a leading voice within your community and an advocate for your healthcare there. And at the same time, you need to, in many cases, know how to read a cost report. Certainly, if you're going to be in a small rural hospital, and the human resources side of it and the contracting side of it, we focus that more in the certification program. And again, focus more on how to improve rural policy and rural health and your local community within the fellows program.
I'd also like to say that we teach advocacy as well, because I do believe it's one of the core requirements of being a leader or really just being a good professional. I do think you need advocacy skills, whether it's on behalf of your family or behalf of your profession, whatever the context. That's a reality in today's world, and an important one.
Yeah, and full disclosure, I'm a huge believer in being a fellow in ACHE. Our CFO, Brock Slaybaugh, is a fellow himself, and he daily brings those skill sets that he learned to NRHA as an organization.
Well, that's encouraging. Maybe the three of us should do a partnership.
Exactly.
Yeah. I'm feeling well. I don't know about you too, but I think that would be great.
You guys are speaking my language. I think advocacy is a leadership skill that is often under-taught. And I think people overthink it and think that advocacy is just legislative and regulatory. But we know as clinicians, you advocate for your patients. I think Alan made a great point. You have to advocate in your community and network, because sometimes your partners are not naturally healthcare. They might be the Farm Bureau or somebody of that nature. So advocacy is such a core, in my opinion, such a core element of leadership. And how do you advocate for your organization, your people, and your perspective on policy changes that are needed. The other thing I think that both of you hit very well is the three of us all lead very large organizations, a lot of members, a lot of diversity in issues and geography. And one of the things that I think is a secret sauce of associations is that connecting locally. So don't wait to try to lead at a national level. You don't go from, joining an association to being its president. Almost everyone that starts that leadership journey really gets bitten at the local level, and they join a local chapter or a state association, and those really become the pipeline for our national leaderships and our great training grounds. There's nothing that replaces that volunteer leadership experience.
Justin, just to add to that too, the local, our local chapters are mostly volunteer led, and so they need help. So you can sort of pick and choose what you want to do and what skills you want to develop, because there's lots of needs. So again, I definitely would reinforce that.
Yeah, in one of our earlier sessions, somebody said, what was the prerequisite for leadership? And I think the answer was a tap on the shoulder. And and so they said the only prerequisite you need is you need to turn when somebody taps you on that shoulder and asks you to be involved, and that's what starts that journey. So I thought it was a great answer, that it's not a formal classwork. Sometimes it's just somebody asking and you responding to the leadership opportunity. We all talked a little bit about some of the skill sets, some of the unique things that clinicians bring to the table as leaders. And I always like to comment that, as a physical therapist, observation is one of our secret powers. We tend to look and watch how people move, and that ability to scan the environment is a skill that translates well to leadership. What are the gaps? And I think we started to talk a little bit about that. I know as I was transitioning my career and looking at executive leadership experiences, one of the gaps that was identified for me was financial, is that I needed to really better understand financial cost sheets, all this stuff, cost current ratio, things of that nature that just were almost a foreign language for me as a clinician. What are there areas besides finance, which is sort of the obvious one, that you see as areas that really clinicians probably need additional skill set or connections in? They're strong on the empathy, strong on the connection, but what areas do you see that are gaps that your programs fill or clinicians can seek in other environments? I'll start with you, Alan.
Thanks. You saw me laughing at that, so obviously you knew I had a little bit teed up on that, even though I didn't know it would be posed like that for the question. Yeah, I think this ties back to advocacy. Public perception drives public policy. You want to move the needle on legislation or policy, you've got to change public perception. And a huge gap is media relations and media savvy. One of the best ways to move any policy forward is to talk to the media. And let's be honest, one of the fastest ways to get yourself fired from any job is to talk to the media. It is a necessary evil. And there is no better person to tell your story than you if you are in a rural community that they really want to hear locally. And it's on a conservative level. 10 to 15 media calls we take a day that we farm out to our members, and we farm them out across specialty, across geographic location. But it's a lot of people that should be telling their story don't feel comfortable in it. And I wish that there were more offerings, and I wish it's an area that we've talked about internally within our organization of beefing up for our membership.
That's a great one. We just instituted as part of our newborn orientation, because with social media, everybody's in media. So we now have, as part of our orientation, media training. So I feel a lot better about that when you said that's the the gap that fills. So we take each of our board members now through media training, because it's everything from responding to a tweet to doing an interview on the Today Show. And it's a unique skill. So Deborah, what do you see as sort of some gaps or some areas that really can be closed as people start to seek moving from clinician to leader?
Well, I'm going to take a little different approach, because when I think about what are the domains of competency that people really need to be a leader, and it's evident actually in a little bit in our board certification, which is probably no surprise. And our board certification is really predicated on doing a job analysis. So we actually go out into the field and look at what is the job that leaders are doing, and then we look at that data and come up with, what does the exam need to look like. But you talked about financial management, and business knowledge is certainly part of that strategy, right? You have to understand how an organization works, how it's governed, how it's structured. I think there are certain bread and butter things that you may just want to get a sense of in terms of the operations. Most clinicians already have healthcare knowledge, and that's another important domain. Another one is communication and relationship management, because people usually don't get fired for not knowing Excel, but they do get fired for not managing their relationships well, or losing the confidence of key supporters or key influencers in the organization. But the other thing that I think is important for people to understand about themselves and their roles is this idea of professionalism and ethics. And I noticed one of your viewers commented about, this idea of what are our responsibilities and what is the ethics of who we are and what we stand for and how we show up every day. And I do think that is also an important dimension of who we are as leaders. So to me, leadership is really the intersection of those things, and different people are going to be strong or need development in different things. If you are self-aware, or if you have the appetite to go through some kind of an assessment process, and we have a competency assessment, there's lots of them out there. Advocacy is certainly part of it, and needed. Agility, resilience, all of those newer skills that we've seen more evident during the pandemic are certainly versions of this. But at the end of the day, I think you have to understand, where your strengths are, where your development needs are, and build an intentional plan around that.
Yeah, those are great insights. I always, I think for physical therapists specifically, we constantly hear, how do I connect to learn operations? Because that's such important if you're moving from therapist to rehab manager, or rehab manager to, some senior role in a hospital, finance, obviously. But I think some of the things you talk about on the advocacy, PR, media skills, just becoming more adept in a lot of those, skill sets makes you advantageous to your system and makes you be able to lead with different leadership styles. So that's I think, great point. So I want to ask a question. Obviously, diversity, equity, and inclusion are organizational priorities for everyone. I think, Alan talked about this, is how do we recruit and attract people from all communities, whether they're rural communities, urban, underserved communities, into health professions, into leadership from that standpoint. That's really even more acute in executive leadership. What are your organizations doing in this space to really attract C-suite or high-level leaders from underrepresented communities? And how are you guys taking on really addressing some of those issues of equity and inclusion in healthcare? And start with you, Deborah.
Well, diversity and inclusion is something that we've been committed to for quite some time. 30 years ago, we started to do research about career attainments of minorities versus whites. And it's not, we do that study every 5 years just to monitor the progression. And it's no surprise that progress is slow and people are not advancing to those roles like we would like. What's interesting also that we have found in those studies is recruitment isn't sometimes the problem, but keeping people in organizations is sometimes the problem, because they may not have the social infrastructure, the support, the environment to be successful. One of the things that I think does work is pursuing postgraduate fellowships, and we're a big advocate of postgraduate fellowships for people who are kind of coming out of programs and wanting to have a learning experience in an organization. So building awareness, educating people how to create environments, that's certainly something we do. We also have a lot of partners. We have an Asian community within ACHE. We have an LGBT community within ACHE. So part of this is letting the community sort of build itself, if you will, growing the community from the inside out. I think that's also important. We also work with a lot of other organizations, who are in this space, who are also working on a common goal. And then we really believe in investment. We give out a lot of scholarships. We do a lot of programming. You mentioned the Dolan Scholar. That program, the Dolan Scholarship Program, is really designed to solve for that middle to C-suite problem, because again, it's oftentimes not the lower rank roles, although that can be an issue, but it's much more difficult for those mid-level people to get in the C-suite. So obviously, having sponsorship programs, mentoring programs, I don't think there can be enough support and cultivation. That some organizations are better at this than others. Some are more wired for it. But again, it takes intention, it takes focused action, and it really requires commitment from the top to really make sure that things are done in the right way and followed through in the right way.
Yeah, I think those are fabulous points. Alan, I'm really interested in your perspective. As we were talking to we have a lot of underrepresentation of certain racial and ethnic groups in the physical therapy profession. And as we started to listen and learn from some of those communities and individuals, I was struck by how similar it was to my upbringing in rural America. I grew up in a town of 1,000, and the awareness of physical therapy, when you don't have somebody from your community from that profession, your likelihood of going into that profession is less. So if you live in a different ethnic community or in that operation and you're not exposed to physical therapy, you generally don't know that as a career option. And I knew that in rural America. Is that where I grew up, you became a teacher, a farmer, a clergyman, or a clergywoman, or a physician. Those were sort of I remember going to, probably embarrassed to say, I remember going to Iowa State University and somebody saying they had an engineering program, and I still thought they drove trains. I was, I didn't, and so the exposure is always in attracting people. And I think, Alan, you made a great point of that on the front end, is how do we attract people from rural communities who want to return to rural communities into that pipeline as part of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So,
absolutely. Well, first, before I get into the seriousness of this topic, let me, as a Kansas Jayhawk, extend once again my sympathies for you being an Iowa Cyclone. But back on the topic that we're really talking about, that is one space where there's so much I love about my organization. But in 1978, our organization began as the American Rural Health Association. It was a group of primary care clinicians working in underserved rural community health centers. And that is the core identity of our organization. 3 years later, that entity merged with a National Rural Hospital CEO Association and a National Rural Researchers Association. And that wasn't painfully diverse enough. And so they set up a structure where when you come in, you identify with a constituency group. And whether it be clinical, frontier, rural health clinic. So we really bring people together within our organization. And once we agree on a path forward, there's consensus, policy follows. And our association was founded on the concept that diversity in the workplace it increases the performance of the organization. And so as such, we actually, since 30 years ago, we had a rural minority council, which now is our rural health equity council to be more inclusive. We have, and that council has seats on our board of trustees. It has seats on our policy developing body, all the way just ensuring that we don't lose track of who we were and who we are. And let me say why that's relevant. And a lot of times when people hear rural, they think of backgrounds such as yours, Justin, or mine from Northeast Kansas, and they don't realize the diversity that is rural America today. And in fact, the impact it has on healthcare. According to Shep Center in North Carolina, the majority of rural hospital closures have happened in communities with high African American, high Latino, Hispanic populations. And that impact has a direct correlation on access to care and the quality of care for these rural communities. So I say that because when I walk in the room and I'm with the National Rural Health Association, I think everyone has a perception of who I am and what I represent, not understanding just the significant diversification that's happening in rural communities all across the U.S. today.
Yeah, I think that's great points. I think we're in community building as association leaders, as healthcare leaders, and helping individuals advocate and be part of their community is critical. And I think diversity and equity and inclusion are just are so paramount to that community building exercise that we do as associations in healthcare. As we sort of get toward the end, I'm going to ask a macro question because I have two great healthcare leaders on the presentation today. We often hear about the need to reform healthcare, and we all have policy objectives that we believe would help reform healthcare. What do you believe is the leadership call in healthcare today as we enter 2022? So I'll go ahead and start with you, Alan. What would you describe as the leadership call for healthcare and reforming our healthcare system?
Yeah, well, let me default to only talking about rural because I want to make sure that I'm in my wheelhouse here. And the last 2 years in the pandemic, it just has really emphasized that the current healthcare system is non-sustainable. The payment structure forces us to count heads in beds instead of really paying our healthcare providers and professionals to keep our community healthy and keep them out of the emergency room to begin with. And so I think you're going to see a lot more movement forward on whether it's global budgeting, looking at some new payment structure for that, whether it's a new model entirely like a rural emergency hospital where you're eliminating inpatient beds and you're really pushing the healthcare into the community. But from a leadership perspective, that is really tough. That type of change, you have to understand, for those that on the call right now that are in a rural community, your families are tied to there. It's not like you can just get a new job without moving your family in many cases. So it takes leadership to take that step forward, that tough step forward, to engage in new payment models, new delivery models, and new structures that really emphasize an outreach and a community engagement outside the walls of a facility.
Yeah, that's great. Deborah, what do you see as in the sort of spectrum of reforming healthcare? What do you see as the leadership call in the next couple of years for healthcare leaders?
Well, I mean, I do think the pervasive problems of cost, quality, access, the problems that seem to have been around for decades, will continue to be present. But I think equity will be more prioritized. But I completely agree with Alan that when you think about the incentive structure, you sort of have to think about what is a leader control, where do they have voice, and where is their workshop to reform. And I think in the incentive world, I think you do need the advocacy to express your voice on the whether it's inside or whatever the workshop is for the leader. I do think there's plenty of opportunity to gain some benefits from redesigning care, from looking at the structure, from looking about what we've been through in the pandemic and what do we hardwire going forward. But I think overall, it's about the paradigm of leaders. How do we think about the future? How do we, how invested are we in really changing it? Unfortunately, historically, I don't think we've been very good about change. And we have these monolithic systems that we work in and live in that will require paradigm shifts. So while we're working sort of on the short term to redesign what we can and control what we can and make all the innovations with telehealth, which was, I think, amazingly progressive during pandemic, I think we also have to look to ourselves to really think about what are those new paradigms that we need to adopt and embrace to really make these changes real and to see a new day in healthcare.
Great. We're getting close to the end. And so before I give you each your parting shot on a lesson learned in leadership or a recommendation for people seeking leadership opportunities, a couple comments that have come in that it just really echoed some of the things we talked about. I had a comment on the importance of mentorship and on internal talent development. I think it's very interesting. We were talking before we went live. The three of us are all internally developed executive leaders. We all came from our organizations in different roles. And so that is a great point that we've seen of how you really groom and develop leaders internally and the importance of membership. I know at APTA, we've been talking a lot beyond membership on coaching and sponsorship and how to really go through the process of that type of leadership development. And we've also had a comment on, just how do you balance this crazy world we live in where you're managing people who are coming in with new demands, childcare, desires for different flexibilities, and how do we manage the workforce of the future? So I think there's been some great comments on the chat tonight, really echoing the adaptability of leadership, the process and the growth of leadership, and constantly evolving as leaders. So to conclude tonight, I want to give you each a parting shot for our listeners and viewers. And it can either be a lesson learned in leadership, both personally or something at your organization, or a leadership perspective that you think would be interesting and intriguing to the listeners. So with that, I'll go ahead and start with Deborah.
Well, I'm sure Ellen's is going to be much more interesting, but so I can't wait to hear that. But yeah, I think when I reflect on my career and when I think about the opportunities before your listeners and others who hopefully will gain the benefit from anything we've said, is really to be intentional about your career. I think a lot of us get caught up in our day-to-day demands, and of which are numerous, and the pandemic has certainly amplified all of that. But I think it's really important for people to really think about where they want to go and what they want to do. There was a comment in here about somebody returning to their hometown in Mississippi and getting back to their home roots. So I do think it's important to think about that and find your own path. There are no right or wrong paths. There are no right or wrong answers here. There's plenty of opportunity. You do need to look for it. You need to be intentional. You need to raise your hand. You need to find the resources you need, be it mentoring, coaching, professional associations. But again, I think taking the first step can certainly be an eye-opener. And I just hope people find a way to really be who they want to be and be the great professionals that I know that they are. So that's really probably all I would have to offer.
Great. Alan, you get the last word.
That's dangerous, I think, for Alan.
Oh, it definitely is.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. Because it was about 10 years ago, and my spouse said that she had hired a plumber to put on a new fixture on our sink. And I said, "What are you doing? Don't you know who I am? I can do that." And $1,600 worth of damage later, I called the plumber. And what a great takeaway, because It's not that I don't have the ability. I think sometimes in leadership, we think we can do it all, and you have a team. And I think the being able to understand your limitations is probably one of the most powerful things or aspects you can have as a leader. Because when you're not relying on a good team around you, mistakes happen. $1,600 mistakes happen. And I think there is a misconception that among people when they aspire for a leadership role, that they have to know all and be all. And it really more is about how do you harness the strengths of the people around you, and how do you help to make them better? Really not focusing on yourself, but on the people around you. So so I just really hit this off on the wrong component on that, but it really is one of the most significant aha moments that I've had when it comes to leadership.
Well, those are fabulous. And I really appreciate both your time and your insights tonight. This has been the third of a 3-part series on leadership and healthcare. And I hope our viewers go back and look at the other versions if they haven't seen those before. But we had a couple comments. We will put together some resources for viewers on how to connect to the programs that exist both at the American College of Healthcare Executives and the National Rural Health Association, and get those out to you. You can connect to us through this show. There's we'll post an email that you can send, or justinmoore@apta.org, and we'll get you those links if you're interested. These organizations offer a great opportunity to connect with people that share your passion and share your desire to pursue a leadership path. So with that, please join me in thanking Deborah Bowen from the American College of Healthcare Executives and Alan Morgan from the National Rural Health Association. And we really appreciate your time this evening and your insights. So thank you.
Justin. Thanks, everybody. Take good care.